Hello, this is week 2, video 5 on sex and gender. So these are kind of the traditional definitions of sex and gender. Sex refers to differences in male and female biology, especially as they relate to biological reproduction. And gender has been defined as the wide range of meanings culturally assigned to biologically sexed individuals. Now, of course, there's a conversation in the world today about these terms and how they relate to each other. There's a consideration of, is this definition of sex binary, and what possibilities are there that aren't entirely male or female? How chromosomes line up with external features, with hormones. And so we might even say that sex is culturally determined as well. A lot of anthropologists would say that and would think about the sort of cultural assignation of sex to individuals. But this is a traditional definition, and the way that sex and gender have been sort of broken out. And then they've been brought together by anthropologists in a term called the sex-gender system. And so what the sex-gender system is meant to signify is the fact that every society has a system for determining the relationship of gender to sex. So every societies may work the system out differently, but every society will have a system that says if you are born with a male sex, you will have these behaviors, these ways of dressing, these ways of modulating your voice, these roles in society, these sexual preferences. We'll talk about that when we get to sexuality a little bit later, and so on. And at the same time, that society will say, and if you're born sexed female, you will have this range of behaviors, dress, status in society, roles that you can play, and so forth and so on. So anthropologists have been interested for a long time in this sex-gender system and how it looks in different societies. Again, the system itself will vary from society to society, but every society will have one, a system of norms around sex and gender. So anthropologists became interested in sex and gender mostly when more female anthropologists entered the field. So for a long time, through much of the 20th century, male anthropologists didn't much study women for a very practical reason, which was that in many of the societies that anthropologists studied, it was a little bit difficult for a male anthropologist to get access to the women. I want to come to your home and interview you, just you and me, could be very problematic for a woman. And a lot of the life of women was sort of secret and hidden from men anyway. So it just wasn't possible for an anthropologist to access that unless, as in the case with Bruce Nauft, he was married to a woman, and his wife was in the field with him, and then she could study the women. One of the problems I have with Nauft's book is that he mentions his wife and how much time she spent with the women, but he doesn't give us any of the information that she gleaned from all of these moments with the women, or he gives us very little. So I think that was a missed opportunity. Anyway, as women came into the field of anthropology, they began to study women. And as they did so, they came to a shocking conclusion that I'll tell you about now, and then we'll problematize as we get to later anthropologists' views on sex and gender. But their shocking conclusion was that female oppression seems to be universal. In every society that we study, women are second-class citizens. They're subject to a great deal of violence at the hands of men. These are patriarchal societies. Even matrilineal societies are patriarchal, and women end up being oppressed. And so they started to question this. Is this universal? How can we study this and see if it is? And so they set about studying this or addressing this question more rigorously through comparative research. So I want to tell you about Margaret Mead, who is probably the most famous cultural anthropologist. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, But if you've heard of any anthropologist, it's likely to be Margaret Mead. She's the only anthropologist I know of who has her own postage stamp. And she also wrote for a lot of general audience publications like Ms. Magazine and others. So she wrote really well, and people liked to read her stuff, especially about feminism and gender and sex. So she was part of something called the Culture and Personality School that's kind of fallen away in anthropology now. It's where anthropology kind of merges with psychology. And anthropologists in the Culture and Personality School felt that societies had a personality. And so individuals within a society would kind of develop an individual psychology that matched the sort of personality psychology of the larger society. And she wrote a very influential book entitled Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies. And she was working in Papua New Guinea. We've been there before with Bronislaw Malinowski here and Clifford Geertz here. Papua New Guinea was a great ground for anthropologists to study cultural diversity, because just like with islands tend to have more biological diversity, and it turns out islands also tend to have more cultural diversity. So in Papua New Guinea, there are all these different ethnic groups living very close to each other with very different lifestyles. So there's just this amazing diversity to study. And Margaret Mead worked among three different societies, and she wrote this quote: "Each of these tribes had, as has every human society, the point of sex difference," and the point of sex difference is really the sex-gender system, "to use as one theme in the plot of social life, and each of these three people has developed that theme differently." So basically this quote is saying each one of these societies has a sex-gender system, but the sex-gender system in each one of these societies is completely different. Okay, so let me take you through her three comparisons. First, she talked about the gentle mountain-dwelling Arapesh. I just love that. It's so poetic sounding. And in this society, both men and women had a peaceful temperament. They both nurtured children, and they were very nurturing towards children. And she also said this society had an almost complete lack of violence and an almost complete lack of a notion of private property. It sounds, in that sense, much like the Junhuanzi that some of you read about last week. Okay, so both men and women are peaceful and nurturing in this conflict-free society. Just down the road, she discovered the fierce cannibalistic Mundagamor. And in this society, both men and women were warlike, suspicious, and distrustful. This was a polygynous society, so polygyny generally indicates some inequality between men and women. And this was not a society where children were nurtured. Often in very warlike societies, children are not nurtured because you don't turn children into warriors by nurturing them. Just the opposite. You turn them into warriors by being really tough on them. Okay, so in the Arapesh, both men and women are peaceful and nurturing. And among the Mundagamor, both men and women are warlike, suspicious, not nurturing. Finally, she studied the graceful headhunters of Chambuli. And in this society, it's polygynous and patrilineal. So there's a sharp distinction between men and women. But the distinction works kind of the opposite from the way you might expect. So in this society, men are the ones who are concerned with their looks. They curl their hair, they wear makeup, their preferred profession is in the arts. They want to work with the arts, they want to be creative, and they're emotionally dependent on women. Whereas women are the workers. They do the fishing, they provide for their families, and they manage their household. They make the decisions for the household. So this is like a matriarchal society, even though it's polygynous and patrilineal. So again, there are these kind of like opposite of the expected gender roles. I can just imagine women coming home at the end of the day from fishing, and it's like the 1950s in the United States. The woman comes in from fishing and, she's like, I'm tired. Where's my dinner? And the man's like, oh, here it is, honey. And look, I curled my hair for you. And, obviously I'm parodying this, but that's kind of what it says to me. And that's kind of the what Margaret Mead set up in this writing. Okay, so each of these tribes had, as has every human society, the point of sex difference to use as one theme in the plot of social life, and each of these three peoples has developed that theme differently. Every one of these societies distinguishes men from women. There's a sex gender system, but that sex gender system is culturally constructed.